A widower's ranch was dying until his daughters brought home. A survivor late October 1884. Out on the ragged edge of the Texas Panhandle, the world looked sun-scorched and half-finished. Wind slid over mesquite and buffalo grass like a hand that never learned gentleness. The sky was a wide tin bowl bleached and rattling with brittle light. There were no church bells here, no rail whistles, no voices, but the coyotes and the creak of an old windmill that kept turning even after a man stopped listening. The Mercer Ranch sat alone in that emptiness, 2 rooms of pine, a barn with one good hinge fencing that leaned like tired men, and acres of land that had once been green enough to fool a young husband into thinking God meant to bless him. Now the soil was thin, the cattle fewer by the season, and the man who owned it had begun to move, like the place did, slow, stubborn, and quietly ashamed of still standing. Before we go on, drop a 1-inch the comments. If you've ever felt a home, go quiet after loss. Elias Mercer was 38 and looked older when the light hit his face wrong. The war had ended almost 20 years back, but the way it lodged inside men didn't obey calendars. He had ridden with cavalry in the last bad stretch of it, then drifted west, because drifting was easier than returning to a town full of people who remembered who you used to be. He hadn't meant to stay. He had meant to keep moving until the inside of him matched the outside of whatever land he found. Then Clara happened. She was a schoolteacher newly arrived from San Antonio with dust in her skirts and laughter in her throat. When Elias first saw her at the trading post, he'd been holding a sack of feed and a debt he didn't want to name. She wore her hair pinned up with a pencil, as if even her beauty was practical. She asked him if the creek north of town was safe to cross in spring. He told her it wasn't. She crossed it anyway on a mule she didn't know how to calm, and she laughed when it tried to buck her into the water. That kind of stubborn joy is a dangerous thing to a man who's lived too long with nothing but his own silence. They married in a church with the windows open because it was too hot for grief to hold people inside. They built the cabin with their own hands. She hung quilts in the doorway and taught their first daughter how to read by firelight. She learned to shoot not because she liked the idea of killing, but because the frontier demanded a woman know how to keep what she loved. Rosie was born first steady-eyed and quiet like a girl who came into the world already listening. 2 years later, May arrived with a cry so loud the horses spooked in the corral. She grew into her name small storms of laughter in a dry place. Elias had thought he was done with surprises. Ma rung dun van. 1,300 CHA. Then Clara died on a winter night when the wind came down like a blade. Fever took her fast, a kind of mercy the land sometimes offers when it's tired of watching a body fight. She was gone before the sun rose, her breath gone quiet between 1 hour and the next, as if she'd simply decided not to wake. Elias stood in the doorway while the doctor packed his bag leather straps creaking in the cold, and he couldn't understand why the world kept making ordinary noises. The kettle still hissed on the stove. The board still creaked and cooled under his boots. Somewhere in the rafters, a sparrow peeped oblivious, as if it had missed the memo of catastrophe. He buried her on the ridge where she used to sit, and watched storms roll in across the flats, her skirt tucked under her knees, her face turned toward the lightning like she was reading letters from God. He dug the grave himself, though the ground fought him frozen 2 feet down. His hands blistered, then bled, then went numb. He didn't stop until the hole was deep enough that no coyote could reach her. He built a white fence around the grave because he needed something to do with his hands besides shake, and because Clara had once said she liked the look of painted wood against wild grass. After that, the ranch began to die in the same way a man does when he doesn't let himself mourn. Not all at once, but in pieces, slow and stubborn. The well went shallow first. Then the south fence rotted through, and 3 calves wandered off into the scrub, never seen again. The garden Clara had coaxed from sour dirt turned to thistle and bindweed, and Elias kept forgetting to pull them. He stopped riding into town unless a bolt of cloth was needed, or the flour ran low. Folks learned not to ask questions. On that land, you learn to mind your own business or get swallowed by someone else's trouble. Mornings came with low light and the smell of cold ash. Elias rose before dawn out of habit, more than hope, his body moving through routines his mind had abandoned. He would stand in the doorway with a tin cup of coffee going cold in his hands, watching the horizon where the air and earth melted into each other, and he would tell himself the same thing every morning: just get through today. The girls moved through the house like ghosts, learning to be solid again. Rosie fetched water from the creek with a quiet competence that scared him sometimes. She was 11, but grief had settled on her shoulders like an extra decade, pressing her spine straight and her mouth into a line. She didn't cry where anyone could see. She kept her mother's apron folded on the chair and wore her hair the way Clara used to braid it, though her fingers fumbled and the plate came out crooked. May chased chickens and argued with coyotes as if she was personally responsible for keeping the world from turning mean. She was 8 and still believed the future could be bargained with if you asked loud enough. She sang to the hens and named the barn mice and left bits of biscuit on the porch for whatever spirits might be listening. Elias didn't have the heart to tell her it wouldn't bring Clara back. They didn't talk much about their mother. Elias didn't forbid it, he just didn't know how to be in the same room with her name. When May asked why the rocking chair by the hearth was always empty, he only said, "Your mama liked that spot." His voice came out flat like a door closing. Rosie learned to stop asking. May learned to ask the wind instead, whispering questions into the dark when she thought no one was listening. By late October of that year, the air sharpened with the promise of cold. Too early for frost, not early enough for mercy. Elias had been counting sacks of dried beans in the pantry winter stores that looked thinner than they should when Rosie came in from the yard with her braid loose and dust on her knees. "Pa," she said, standing in the doorway with her chin lifted, "we're going to the ridge for herbs." Like Mama did. It was said like a challenge, and a prayer daring him to say no and hoping he wouldn't. Elias looked at her hands. They were small but already calloused from work, the skin rough, where the rope had worn it raw. He wanted to say no. He wanted to keep them close, where the land couldn't snatch them the way it had snatched Clara fever, or fall, or simple bad luck. It didn't matter. The land took what it wanted. But he also remembered a rule he'd lived by before he learned how to close his heart. Don't cage fire unless you want it to die. Stay where you can hear May, he said finally. Rosie nodded, solemn as an oath. May was already halfway out the door, barefoot, a gourd tied at her hip, bouncing with each step. "Don't go toward the canyon," Elias called after them, his voice sharper than he meant. May waved without looking back. "We won't, Pa." Rosie was the kind who meant her promises. May was the kind who meant two. The ridge lay a mile east where the land cracked into red shale and scrub pine that grew low and stubborn. Clara had found yarrow there for fevers, and sage for rubbing into meat, and wild mint that May liked to chew until her lips went green, and her breath smelled like summer. Rosie moved careful through the brush-gathering stems with the attention of someone who understood scarcity. May skipped from stone to stone like she was crossing a river, only she could see humming a tune their mother used to sing while kneading bread. The sun climbed slow, pulling warmth from the earth. Wind tugged at the girl's sleeves and lifted the dust in lazy spirals. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried sharp and lonesome, and May answered it without thinking, a nonsense whistle she'd invented when she was 4. Rosie glanced at her, and for a moment the older girl's face softened into something close to a smile. Then a sound floated up out of the gully near the canyon's throat. Not wind, not animal, something thin and human, a breath, trying to be a voice. May stopped so fast the gourd swung into her hip. She held her breath, eyes wide. The sound came again, shorter this time, as if whatever made it didn't have much left to spare. "Rosie," she whispered. "Did you hear?" "I heard." Rosie's eyes were already scanning the rocks, the scrub, the shadow line where the canyon opened its mouth. The canyon was a scar in the earth, wide and deep enough to swallow a horse if it wanted. Their father had warned them about it since they were small. People went down there and didn't come back. Not always because they fell. Sometimes because they didn't want to be found. The safe thing, the smart thing, was to run home and haul Elias back with rope and a rifle. Rosie knew that. She also knew the sound she'd heard didn't have time for smart. "Stay here," she said to May, and started down. May didn't argue. She just followed her bare feet sliding in the loose shale. They descended in silence, grabbing roots where they could, their breaths coming shallow and quick. The gully leveled into a patch of shade where a fallen cedar lay like a dead bridge across the stones. That's where they found her. She was half in the mud, half in the weeds, a shape that might have been a shadow if the girls hadn't seen the breath fogging faintly at her mouth. Black hair spilled around her face, tangled with grass and blood that had dried dark along her temple. A buckskin dress clung to her in ripped strips, the beadwork torn loose and scattered in the dirt. One leg bent wrong at the knee, swollen and blue. Her hands were scraped, raw fingers curled like claws, as if she'd crawled until the earth let her go no farther. Rosie's stomach turned. May made a small broken sound, half gasp, half sob. The woman's eyes fluttered open and locked onto them. Dark eyes alert and fierce, refusing to die even while the body tried. She spoke a word, neither girl understood her voice, a dry leaf in wind. May knelt fast, her small hands hovering over the woman's shoulder. "She's alive." Rosie swallowed hard, her mind racing. Pa said never walk away from a soul in need. He also said some souls bring trouble like thunder. But there was no thunder here, only a woman bleeding into red dirt and two girls who had to decide what mercy looked like. "We have to get Pa," Rosie said, though her hands were already sliding under the woman's arm fingers, finding purchase in the torn buckskin. May shook her head, tears shining in her eyes, like small stars refusing to fall. "She won't last. Look at her." The woman's breaths were thin ropes fraying at the edges. Nothing to tie time to. Each exhale seemed like it might be the last, a door closing that wouldn't open again. Rosie made a decision. She didn't feel old enough to hold a weight settling on her shoulders that felt heavier than the woman's broken body. "We're taking her home." It should have been impossible. Two girls with small frames and bare feet against stone and distance, and a body that had already half surrendered to the earth. But fear does not always make you run. Sometimes it makes you lift. Sometimes it makes you prove who you are when no one else is watching. They hauled her up, one arm draped over each shoulder, the woman's weight distributed between them, like a secret they both agreed to carry. The woman groaned once, a sound pulled from somewhere deep and animal, but didn't fight. Maybe she couldn't. Maybe she understood that the only way to survive was to let strangers carry you toward an uncertain mercy. The climb back up the gully burned Rosie's knees, scraped them raw against the shale. May's arms shook like saplings in wind, her small body trembling with effort she refused to acknowledge. The woman's blood dripped into the dirt in steady intervals, darkening it in dots that the sun quickly drank, leaving only faint shadows behind. Twice the older girl almost slipped her boot, finding loose rock instead of solid ground. And twice May shoved her small shoulder under the woman's weight, with a fierceness that surprised them both, a stubbornness inherited from a mother. Neither of them could afford to forget. By the time they reached flat ground, their breath came in ragged gasps, and their muscles screamed. The day had turned. The sky was thickening with a pale, hard gold that promised evening, soon the kind of light that made everything look both beautiful and temporary. Their home was a smudge on the horizon, too far for help, and too close for fear to change anyone's mind now. They walked anyway, step by aching step. Elias was mending a saddle strap on the porch when he saw them crest the rise, three figures moving as one awkward shape against the dying light. At first he thought May had brought home a stray calf or a wounded deer. The girl had a habit of adopting things that ought to be left alone. Then he saw the third set of legs dragging between theirs, human legs that barely moved, and something cold and old tightened behind his ribs like a fist closing. His hand went to the gun on his hip from pure reflex muscle memory, from years that had taught him to expect trouble before kindness. He didn't draw, but he could feel the metal against his palm like a voice he didn't want to listen to, whispering old warnings about strangers and blood. "Rosie," he called, stepping forward, his boots loud against the worn planks. "May, stop right there." Rosie didn't stop. Her face was white from strained sweat streaking through the dust on her cheeks. "Pa, she's dying." Elias closed the distance in 3 long strides, his heart hammering harder than it should. He took one look at the woman sagging between his daughters. Her skin sun-dark and streaked with mud, the beadwork torn from her dress and scattered like lost prayers, the way the earth clung to her like family. And he knew what she was, before his mind could name it. Apache. The old stories that settlers told each other around fires flashed through him. Unbidden raids and scalps and stolen cattle soldiers in blue coats hunting shadows through canyons. Women and children caught in crossfire. Nobody wanted to claim. He'd seen plenty of blood on both sides during his army years. He'd translated words meant to keep peace and watched them turn to smoke. He also knew those stories made cowards of men who should have known better, who built walls out of fear instead of sense. He looked down at May's tiny hands, slipping on the woman's arm, white-knuckled and shaking. He looked at Rosie's jaw, clenched in a way that said she'd rather break than let go that same stubborn set Clara used to get when she believed she was right and the world was wrong. He saw something in their eyes he hadn't seen since Clara died. Conviction. Purpose. The kind of certainty that didn't ask permission. His heart didn't have time for doubt. He scooped the woman up in his arms without another word. She was light, lighter than grief, lighter than memory. Her body a collection of bones held together by will and not much else. Rosie and May stumbled after him, breathing hard, their legs finally giving in to the exhaustion they'd been fighting. Inside the cabin, the air still carried a whisper of lavender soap. When the day went warm, a scent Clara had loved, and Elias couldn't bear to wash away. He hated that it lingered. It was like a ghost insisting on staying kind, refusing to let him forget what used to fill this space. He laid the woman on Clara's bed, their bed, and for a second his throat went tight, his breath catching on something sharp. A stranger on her sheets, a stranger's blood darkening the quilt Clara had pieced together from old dresses and flour sacks. But death didn't care whose bed it borrowed, and mercy didn't wait for permission. "Boil water," he said to Rosie, his voice rougher than he meant. She ran to the hearth without hesitation, her hands already reaching for the kettle. May hovered near the bedside, her eyes wide and wet. "Is she gonna die, Pa? Not if I can stop it?" He didn't know if that was true. He said it anyway, because it was what fathers were supposed to do, lie with confidence when the truth was too heavy for small shoulders. The woman's leg was a mess, broken, maybe splintered the knee, swollen purple and twisted at an angle that made Elias's stomach turn. He'd set bones before in the army, working under canvas tents that smelled of blood and chalk and men screaming into leather straps. He'd watched surgeons do it with steady hands and cold efficiency, treating bodies like machines that just needed the right adjustments. But he'd never done it himself. And he'd never done it on a woman whose eyes watched him like he might be the next threat, whose gaze tracked his every movement with the wariness of someone who had learned not to trust hands that touched without asking. He cleaned her wounds with boiled water, the cloth coming away red each time. He pressed clean fabric to bleeding cuts on her arms and face, working methodically, trying not to think about the fact that she was someone's daughter, maybe someone's mother or sister. When he straightened her leg, pulling until the bone found its place again, she bit down hard on her own hand, rather than cry out, her teeth breaking skin, a thin line of blood appearing at the corner of her mouth. He respected that. Didn't say it, but felt it settle in his chest like a weight he'd carry. Hours dragged through the night like wounded animals. Rosie dozed by the door, her head against the frame, still too alert to fully sleep. May lay curled under the table, clutching the rag doll Clara had sewn from scraps, her small body twitching occasionally in dreams Elias hoped were kinder than the day had been. He sat in the chair beside the bed hat brim pulled low over his eyes, watching the woman's breathing like it was a campfire that might go out if he blinked too long. Near dawn she woke. Not startled. Not grateful. Just awake in the way of people who have survived worse than a stranger's kindness, who wake expecting another fight. Her lips moved dry and cracked. Aiyana. Elias repeated it softly, the syllables unfamiliar on his tongue. The sound didn't fit him yet, too round and warm for a mouth that had gotten used to silence. Aiyana. She watched his mouth like she was measuring whether the name would be safe in it, whether he would wear it with respect or carelessness. He offered water in a tin cup. She drank, without taking her eyes off him, swallowing in small sips, cautious. When he pulled her sleeve back to clean a cut near her shoulder, he saw ink on her skin, black lines, sharp and deliberate geometric patterns that spiraled and connected, like roads on a map only she could read. Not decoration. Story. Bloodline marks. Elias had seen similar on Apache scouts who rode with the U.S. Army men who carried their people's history in their skin because paper and words could be burned or stolen, but flesh remembered. He eased the cloth down, gently covering the marks as if he hadn't seen them. Aiyana didn't flinch. She didn't need to hide what she was. Her eyes told him she wouldn't, even if it cost her. Morning came weak and thin, the light pale as milk. The prairie wore a skin of silver dew that would burn off by mid-morning. Aiyana drifted in and out of sleep, fever still fighting her, pulling her down into dreams that made her murmur words Elias didn't understand. Rosie fed her broth in small spoonfuls, patient, as a saint waiting each time for her to swallow before offering more. May rinsed the bloodied cloths in a basin and hummed under her breath a lullaby she'd almost forgotten. One Clara used to sing when storms came and the girls couldn't sleep. Aiyana listened even through the fever haze. Her eyes softened a little when May sang something in her face, easing like a door unlocking from the inside. Days passed. The cabin absorbed a new rhythm, adjusting to the presence of someone who didn't belong, but had been welcomed anyway. Elias watched cautious, his gaze often drifting to the horizon, alert for hoofbeats in the distance. The frontier didn't send Apache women alone into canyons, unless something had already broken raids, betrayals, death, that left survivors scattered like seeds in a fire. He knew that. He also knew his daughters had made a choice, now stitched into their bones, woven into who they were becoming. There was no undoing it, no taking back the moment they decided mercy mattered more than safety. On the 6th day, Aiyana sat up without help, her movements slow and deliberate. She moved like someone testing the limits of a body that had betrayed her, one leg still bound in splints Elias had whittled from cedar and wrapped with torn strips of cloth. She wore Clara's old shawl around her shoulders, wool the color of dried grass. It fit her like it had been waiting for someone else to need it, like cloth knew no loyalty except to warmth. "You didn't have to do this," she said, her voice quiet but steady. Her English was careful, accented the words chosen as if each one cost breath. Elias exhaled through his nose, his gaze on the window where dust motes drifted in pale light. "Maybe not. But you did." He didn't answer right away. "Then we don't leave folks to die." Her gaze lingered on him, a look that wasn't gratitude so much as evaluation. The kind that asked, "What does that mean to you?" She didn't press. She had learned somewhere that some men must arrive at their truths the long way. Strength returned to her like water seeping back into dry ground. She didn't sit idle. Elias tried once to tell her to rest. She looked at him, calm as stone. "A body heals when it remembers it is needed," she said simply. And then she got up anyway. The first thing she did was step outside barefoot into the morning chill and press her palm to the earth. Not dramatic, not ceremonial, just a quiet touch, like greeting an old friend after a hard time. Rosie watched from the stoop, thoughtful. May copied her without asking why. Then Aiyana limped toward the corral, eyes narrowing at a gap in the stall wall where the wind slipped through. She mended it with rope and wood scraps, tying knots tight enough to last a season. She repaired the barn latch. She piled straw so rain wouldn't ruin it. She tested fence posts by tapping them until she found the hollow ones, then replaced them with saplings she cut herself, leaning on a cane Elias carved for her. She didn't ask permission. She didn't wait for praise. She just worked the way people work when survival has taught them labor is a language. Rosie watched and learned. May followed like a shadow with questions in her eyes. Out in the field, Aiyana knelt between them and showed them tracks. Not by size, she said, by rhythm. She taught them to listen for the sound that wanted to hide, the shift in grass that wasn't wind, the pause a rabbit makes before it bolts, the low hush of a snake sliding under rock. At night, she hummed songs under her breath. They weren't lullabies exactly, more like a rope tying courage to the dark. Elias never asked what they meant. He understood enough to respect what he didn't know. If the ranch had been a wounded animal, Aiyana didn't heal it with pity. She healed it with purpose. The change came quietly. Horses settled. The fence held. May started humming again while she fed chickens. Rosie's shoulders eased a fraction. Elias caught himself rising in the morning with something close to expectation. That realization scared him more than the hard years had. Hope always did. One evening, Rosie and May brought Aiyana a small bouquet of sage and prairie flowers. Rosie offered it like a treaty. "We like learning from you," she said. "You don't look at us like we're too small." Aiyana touched the girl's cheeks lightly. Children become strong when someone trusts them to be. Elias heard that from the porch. The words lodged under his ribs in a place he had stopped checking for life. Late summer burned itself into fall. The ranch looked straighter, not just in wood and rope, but in the way people moved within it. Then the land warned them. Elias found hoofprints at dawn near the creek, deep fresh, too heavy for a rancher's slow ride. They stopped and circled, doubled back, then vanished into brush, as if the rider wanted to disappear more than he wanted to travel. Elias's mouth went dry. He had learned that kind of sign in war. Men who circle are not passing by. They are testing. He brought Aiyana out. She crouched, ran fingers over the edges, and her face shifted. Recognition, not fear, but a tightening like a bow being pulled. "Hunters," she said quietly. Of what Elias asked, though he already knew. Of people. He waited. Silence has weight in the panhandle. It can crush a man if he doesn't let it speak. She finally said, "They took my camp." Her eyes didn't wander. She didn't perform sorrow. She just placed it there bare as bone. Not soldiers, not settlers. Men who trade humans like cattle. "They killed my father. They killed my sister. They chased me until my leg broke on stone." May and Rosie had come out behind the door. Now they froze, small hands clenching cloth. Elias's jaw tightened. He felt the old vow wake up in his body, the one he'd made at Clara's grave without words. "I will not lose family again." "They'll come here," he said. Aiyana nodded once. "They follow what they believe is unfinished." Wind slid through the yard like a cold finger. Elias looked at his daughters and understood there was no road left but the one in front of him. "Then we prepare," he said. Aiyana met his gaze as equal, not guest. "We prepare." That night the wind didn't howl. It waited. Moonlight washed the ranch pale and sharp. Elias put Rosie and May in the cellar beneath the floorboards, locking it from above. He hated the sound of that lock turning. It felt too close to a coffin lid. "Stay down there," he whispered, tucking blankets around them. "No matter what you hear." Rosie's voice was steady. "We will." May clutched his shirt. "Pa." He kissed her hair. "I'm right here." He took his rifle and stood by the window. Aiyana moved by the barn wall, carving arrowheads from broken fence posts, sharpening them on a stone like her mother had taught her. She limped, but never slowed. Neither of them spoke. Some nights words are a luxury. The tremor came first, faint rhythmic wrong for thunder. Hooves. Many. Elias listened the way Aiyana had taught his girls for what was hiding. 6 riders broke from the dark. Faces wrapped, guns slung low, their horses trained to move quiet. They spread in a half circle, not to fight, but to claim. A man with a lantern stepped forward. His voice carried a smile without warmth. "Bring her out, Cowboy." Elias stepped onto the porch, rifle aimed. "Nobody here belongs to you." The man chuckled. "Charity makes men stupid." Elias didn't blink. "You're not taking her." The lantern rose. A hand signaled. The first shot cracked. Elias dropped behind the porch beam and fired back, controlled clean. Bullets sparked off iron. Horses reared. The night filled with smoke and dust. Aiyana moved like shadow. She climbed onto a woodpile, loosed an arrow, and a rider fell with a grunt that the dark swallowed. She slid down, limped across the yard, shot again. Another man screamed and toppled. Elias dropped a third with his rifle before the man could reach the barn. Then a bullet grazed Elias's ribs, hot as a brand. He stumbled, tasted iron. Aiyana saw it, but she did not stop. She fired from the ground low and true, striking the leader's horse so it bucked. The old lantern swung wildly. The leader dismounted furious now and raised his revolver at Aiyana. Elias stepped forward to cover her empty rifle in hand. He was ready to go down if that was what keeping family meant. Aiyana released her last arrow first. It cut through Moonlight and lodged in the leader's chest. He dropped to his knees, lantern falling into dust. Then he folded face first into the dirt, like a man who finally understood the world didn't owe him victory. The remaining riders hesitated, saw death in the yard, and fled. Hoofbeats faded. The prairie held its breath. Then silence returned, not peace, but the quiet you get when a storm decides to pass you by. Elias's strength went out in a rush. His knees buckled. He hit the ground hard. Aiyana was there instantly, pressing cloth to his ribs. "Stay with me," he grimaced. "I ain't going anywhere." The cellar hatch scraped open. Rosie and May burst out crying, their feet slapping dirt. May fell beside him, sobbing into his chest. Rosie clung to his arm. "Pa, don't die," May choked. Elias wrapped an arm around both girls. "I'm right here." Rosie looked up at Aiyana with pleading eyes. "Please." Aiyana swallowed guilt, flashing over her face like a shadow. "I should have died in that canyon," she whispered. "They wouldn't have come." May shook her head hard. "No, we found you. You didn't bring danger." Rosie nodded fiercely. "We'd do it again." Elias pulled himself upright with a hiss. "Look at me, Aiyana." She did. "If we had to choose again," he said, voice rough, "we'd choose the same." Something in Aiyana's eyes broke not into weakness, but into release. Tears slid down quiet as rain. She put her hand on the earth beside his knee, pressed her palm there, like she was giving the land the weight she carried. For a while, they just breathed. Smoke drifted away. The moon climbed. "Let's get inside," Elias said finally. "Tomorrow's comin'." They went in together, wounded, shaking alive. The morning after was pale and still. Frost glittered on grass like a second skin. Elias moved slow, ribs wrapped tight. Aiyana stayed near him the way a person stays near a fire that has proven it can keep you warm. Not hovering. Just there. Life didn't stop for pain on the frontier. It never had. Within days, Aiyana returned to labor. Not as repayment, but as belonging. She reinforced the fence with boiled sapling roots braided into rope. She replaced the cracked leather on tack. Elias worked beside her when breath allowed saying little. The silence between them had changed. It no longer sat like a wall. It sat like a bridge. One afternoon, Aiyana limped beyond the cabin to a patch of untouched ground. She stood there a long time, eyes on the soil. When Elias approached, she traced a line in the dirt. "This ground is good," she said softly. "If we let it be." She began clearing it with a wooden hoe. Rosie and May rushed out to help, hands eager. Aiyana guided them. Not too deep, she told May. Roots must breathe. They planted sage, mint yarrow, sweet grass, simple things, true thing. Aiyana pulled a small leather pouch from her waist, emptied a few seeds into her palm. She didn't explain their origin. She didn't need to. She tucked them into soil with care, then pressed her hand to the earth, and whispered in her own language. Rosie bowed her head without being asked. May did the same. Elias removed his hat. The garden became a promise, the way some fires do, small, steady, alive. Evenings grew warmer inside the cabin. They sat by the hearth with tin mugs of tea. Rosie asked Aiyana questions about stars and tracking, and how to know when the wind was lying. May curled at her side, sketching circles in ash, with a stick humming her own version of Aiyana's night song. Elias watched it, feeling something alter in him, not with shock, but with the slow, stubborn way land changes underwater. One night he caught himself smiling. A real smile. It startled him like a gunshot. Aiyana noticed and said nothing. She only passed him a mug of sage tea, her fingers brushing his for half a second longer than needed. Warmth traveled where her skin met his. It was not a promise. Not yet. But it was not nothing. May looked between them, eyes wide with the kind of certainty only children trust. Pa smiles more. When she's here, she whispered to Rosie. Rosie answered, That means she's supposed to stay. May marched up to Aiyana like someone delivering a verdict. Can we call you something special? Aiyana blinked. Special, not just her or the lady. Like family. Rosie stood beside her sister, suddenly shy. Miss Aiyana. The name wasn't ownership. It wasn't distance. It was the soft space humans build when they want someone to belong without taking them. Aiyana's throat worked. She nodded once. I would be honored. Elias felt the word honored land in his chest like a seed. He didn't trust himself to speak, so he only nodded. Late autumn came with copper light. One evening Aiyana stood on the hill above the house, wrapped in Clara's shawl, watching the horizon. Elias walked up beside her. He didn't ask if she was all right. He didn't crowd her. He just stood where he could share the wind. After a long silence, she spoke, not looking at him. I thought belonging was only to the place where your people sleep in the earth. He listened. But the earth under my feet still holds me, she said, voice steady. Even here. Even. With you. Elias swallowed. The wind trailed over the grass gentler than it had been in years. She turned her face slightly toward him. I was hunted by what I lost. Now I feel guided by what I found. He stepped closer until they stood shoulder to shoulder. He didn't touch her. The closeness was enough. Whatever road you choose, he said quietly, you won't walk it helpless. Her gaze lifted toward the horizon, past pain, past fear, toward something that didn't have a name yet. A home, she murmured, is where the breath inside you stops shaking. Elias felt his ribs tighten around that sentence. He thought of Clara, of the ridge of the years he had spent breathing like a man braced for another blow. He looked down the slope at his cabin at Rosie, and May's laughter drifting through the door like smoke. He didn't know if love was what was growing between him and Aiyana. Love was a big word. The land had taught him to be careful with big things. But he knew this, the place inside him that had died with Clara was not dead anymore. It was awake. It was cautious. It was trying. They walked down together. Rosie and May met them on the porch, waving like the world had become safe enough to be loud again. Inside, the hearth fire threw amber light on the walls, warm and steady. Aiyana paused at the threshold, letting the heat touch her face as if to make sure it was real. Then she stepped inside. No grand vows, no sudden embrace, only the sound of a door closing softly behind the four of them, and the wind outside learning a new way to pass by. Because some homes don't return in a single miracle. They return in seeds, in repaired fences, in shared silence, in two daughters, brave enough to lift a wounded stranger out of a canyon and carry her into the middle of their grief. And if the Prairie ever tried again to take what the Mercer Ranch had rebuilt, it would find something different waiting there. Not a man alone, not children surviving, not a woman hunted, but a family that had learned belonging is a choice. You make every morning the way you choose to keep a fire alive.